Now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're here talking to Edmund Marriage. Before I bring Edmund back on, don't forget, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com and the Institute of Applied Energetics, AppliedEnergeticsInstitute.com. And you can always sign up for our weekly newsletter at www.justenergyradio.com. You can also check out our over 4 years of archives filled with excellent programming just like this. Edmund, before the break, I said that I was going to throw a translation question at you, and I got a little bit confused. I mean, I really like ancient mysteries and the whole Sumerian thing, and there was something that was in the book that kind of got me a little bit confused. See, this is like I actually did read it. But the book talks about the translation of the name Dinger, and for those listening, whatever, Dinger Enlil-Lee. So Dinger Enlil-Lee. And it says that the correct translation of Dinger is Dinger-Gili, like Engeli. But where I got confused was it seemed like it was changing the translation from Enlil to Enki or Engi, but wouldn't that change the line of command?
I'm not familiar with that particular passage, and I'll check it out.
I should have bookmarked it.
Yeah, clearly there's a clear distinction between Enlil, Enlil, and Enki, Enki. The history or the speculation on the subject suggests that these two disagreed with each other and fought wars, etc. If you look at Plato's accounts, which are excellent, I think, Plato was very anxious that people did not say bad things about the gods, particularly to children. And I think that, to be honest, these people had been through hell. They had an unbelievable task. Their social organization, from as I read it and look at it, and O'Brien translated, is absolutely superb. And they left us superb social organization. We think democracy is great, but Plato said democracy always leads to debt, bankruptcy, and chaos. And wasn't he right? And the old system of social organization was the appointment of a king on merit. He had to be trained for 20 years, and his job was to hold everything together and act as a representative of all the people. He didn't have possessions. He just simply had to make sure that everything ran smoothly and that justice was maintained, that he got the best advisors around him to advise on everything that was done, and people who were advisors had to have their 20-year training. And it was a very, very important system. We, and both you in America and Britain, we had a constitution. Our constitution for both of us was based on the 1688-89 Constitution and Rule of Law. And many countries around the world have that. And the concept there is the contract between the crown and the people, so that the crown and the monarch looks after the people. I'm not quite sure how it translates in America, but the principle is a tripartite arrangement of a balance between the powers of the crown. That's why we all swear our oath of allegiance to the Queen in this country, or we did do. Our MEPs are sent to Europe and don't have to swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen. We have a House of Lords, which I think is similar to the two breakdown between our House of Lords and Commons is similar to yours. And the idea was that the Lords is totally independent, not politically orientated, and when we have a House of Commons. Now, the idea from our Constitution is there should be a fair balance between those three bodies. We call it a triumvirate system in order to get the best possible debate, the best possible people forward to deal with the problems on behalf of the people, on behalf of the monarch. And it's a partnership. And we developed that system. They did put the bishops and the church into the House of Lords, so the church had a role to play. There was the issue on maybe something like 1,100 years of bitter feuding between the Catholic Church and the Crown and the dominance of the Pope. But we resolved all that in 1888 to 89 when we appointed a man and a woman as head of state. Mary, who was part of the British royal family, and William of Orange, who was a brilliant general and a super bloke, and everybody was pleased to have him around. And I went looking at some of the dockyard down at Devonport in Devon, which he was responsible for upgrading and improving for a British Navy. So I know I'm rambling on, but our Constitution and your Constitution is immensely important so that we do not concentrate power into the hands of a small group of politicians, which is what has happened in Britain, with disastrous consequences. And those politicians have passed our sovereignty and those powers to a European Parliament, which is an even bigger disaster. And so I actually went to a meeting today and asked an MP, please, can we have our Constitution back? And I think that's the same for most countries at the moment, because we need to be able to realize that if we have a division between our political parties, we're back to this idea of tribal groups building barriers and walls and waving spears at each other, when we all should be working together in total harmony, which was the way the ancient city-state system worked. At a great city like Mari, which is unbelievably efficient, simple if you like, but absolutely amazing technology at 4000 BC, there were over 200 craft trades and guilds. And everybody's self-interest, people trying hard, made the whole community thrive and prosper. And that's where we need to be today. So people actually work for each other and with each other for everybody else's interests at heart, and not to have rival bands. My God says this, your God says that, or whatever, or my politics is this, your politics is that. We actually have to wake up and realize that we must all work very closely together, whatever our color, or creed, or belief, or wherever we are on the planet. If we don't work together, when we will continue this dreadful slide towards extinction, maybe.
But isn't there, well, you know what, let's just move on, because we could get into this whole political conversation. I just like to avoid it.
Well, I've tried to take the politics and religion out of it, which I think is the answer. But people will listen to my own particular view, and they'll have their own ideas, and some will agree and some won't.
Well, you know, the religion part I love talking about because, you know, I'm a good Jewish Catholic. So that just kind of tells you where I stand. But anyway, one of the things that's in the book is a translation of the Barton cylinder seals, which is a number of different, for the listeners, a number of different tablets that have the cuneiform, the Sumerian text on it, and they tell stories. And one of the stories, and actually it looks like it's a whole series, talk about the arrival of the Annunaki, the Shining Ones, to some place. When they arrive at this place, are they arriving at this European Lebanon area, or are they talking about actually their arrival on the Atlantic Ocean location?
We have an awful lot of clues because we can look at the biblical information, the Hebrew Bible. we can look at the books of Enoch, which is a very detailed account of what appeared to be a brilliant observer who is asked to go up to the planted highlands and record all that was going on. And the icing on the cake from a totally independent source are what are called the Kar-Sag epics. Now, it was the Reverend Professor George Barton at Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania who did the original translations, because he was the man at the time who had taken the trouble to understand that Sumerian cuneiform had evolved from a much earlier, very sophisticated, in fact, but simple picture language. And in order to be able to translate cuneiform, you have to understand where the cuneiform came from and how it changed totally over a 3,000 or 4,000 year period. So if you started with the latest cuneiform in Akkadian at 1000 BC, you'd never understand it, never translate it properly, unless you went right back to the beginning to see how it had evolved. And this, O'Brien did this, something which hardly anybody else has done. That's why he's unique, that's why he's special, because he realized the importance of that picture language. Now, that original picture language with an associated sound shows up on the Phaistos disc, and that's on the website for people to look at and see those lovely signs. And when you begin to look at all the various early symbols and signs, they tie in with this picture language. So the ordinary people were given a spatial, something that was easy to read, picture language, in the same way that when we in England drive across the continent, we all have road signs to look at, a standardized system of road signs, so we don't make any mistakes as to where we're going. And that's how the ordinary people, they were given a picture language which precedes Egyptian hieroglyphs, precedes all the other texts. Even the Indo-European texts would appear to be based on this picture language and are common symbols all around the world from 3000, 4000 BC.
Can I make one little comment, and then you can go on? It seems like when you look at the cuneiform text, that it's actually much more phonetically based, and and the symbols are not. It doesn't look like a bird. It doesn't look like water. I mean, it doesn't look like anything. Where when you look at the Egyptian text, I mean, they're pictures. There's an ibis. There's a snake. It seems very like a long stretch that the Egyptians actually developed out of the Sumerians, because I don't even see any commonality between the two.
Yes, this is where L.A. Waddell does such a brilliant job, and I've got Learning from History Part 5. Waddell recognized that the Egyptian picture language, if you like, evolved from the very earliest Sumerian picture language. The other complication is that Enoch refers to writing and recording what was going on at Kar-Sag, the Garden of Eden. And one of the quotes is that Enki takes a pen or brings the books to Enoch to write, and Enoch writes with a quill pen in what is called the speedy writing. Now, the speedy writing was the alphabet, or Aleph Beg, as it's called in very early time. So the Aleph Beg, or the alphabetic text, was always there, going back to these very earliest times. And the Aleph Beg, or the alphabet, was in-house and kept in-house. And we see this coming right the way through to Druid times, where you have that particular form of a very efficient, very quick, speedy writing, very simple, speedy writing being used by the administrators. Ashburnapal, the great king in Assyria, says that he learnt the language or writing from before the flood at the kingship school. And the many other references which give us the clues that there were those two quite different writing systems. So the alphabet or the Aleph Beg was very early. At the same time, very early on, were the pictorial symbols. Although the earliest signs we have are about 9000 BC, which are the tokens, the work of a lady called Shmant Bassarat, I think it is, who showed that simple standardized tokens were in use from the time of Jericho right the way across the region of the Fertile Crescent. A standardized system of 2 bags of grain, 2 sheep, whatever it may be. And these were the first clay-fired objects found in the hearts of the ancient fires and stuck in cardboard boxes until she began to see how important they were. And it was a double-entry system where a farmer would make a piece of clay, put his mark on it, and how many bags of grain or how many sheep he'd taken into the central communal center, which is the city-state, if you like, or the formative city-state. And so there's a double-entry system. He had his records, they had a set, so that he was paid and could check his own production, which was paid into the community. And so this is, again, extraordinary examples of great sophistication, accounting, mathematics, sophisticated organization at these very early times.
But, even with that, there's a certain amount of, and I'm sorry about playing devil advocate here, but there seems like there's a certain amount of discrepancy. Okay, they're making these little clay things for people to carry around, like their little Visa debit card. But in the same breath, they're building pyramids and they're making these monolithic structures. Or you've talked about Baalbek. There's that, I don't know, what is it, 500-ton. There's those giant stones that they moved around, but they're running around with these little pieces of clay. It seems incongruent.
Well, you've got obviously an elite where the knowledge resides, and of course the knowledge on building resided with the masons. And the mason's job was to pass knowledge from father to son over thousands of years. And you find that extraordinary knowledge coming through the line of masons. And the Freemasons, of course, come along very much later. But the one class or group of people who passed knowledge from father to son who survived were the Masons, because much later on, when everything was knocked flat by cometary debris and wars and fighting, the first thing a king wanted was the Masons to build it all together, build it up again. So you've got different people having different needs. If you really just want to record how many sheep or how many bags of grain you take into the center of Jericho, then that's a simple job for the farmer, very straightforward, something he can cope with. When you're talking about the building of the Baalbek platform and also the pyramids, where you have the most extraordinary technological skills being deployed, it may well be that was much later. Certainly the pyramids were built in 2,500 BC, most of them within a 100-year period. And the blocks were massive. It may have been concrete. It may have been. I don't know. We've got a lot of ideas on what it was made with and how it was constructed, but there must have been a much greater sophistication than we can imagine. But Baalbek, there are 3 850-ton stones, beautifully, perfectly cut, fitted together, so you can hardly get a knife or a razor blade between the joins, on top of, I think it's 16 450-ton blocks of that particular limestone, which has a specific gravity, which allows you to calculate accurately the weights. And in the quarry, there are 2 stones. In fact, not many people know this, and I didn't until recently, but there are still 2 stones in the quarry. One weighs 1,250 tons, which is the stone of the south, which is tipped at an angle, and there is another stone which doesn't look as though it was completed, which is 1,450 tons. And so the level of there was a 1,250-ton obelisk in the Aswan quarry of pink granite, and that clearly was a fault in it and lays there now because it had a fault. But they were very ambitious on what they moved and how they moved things. They even took pink granite to these massive columns, 64-foot high columns of the Baalbek temple. So that pink granite was taken from the Aswan quarry in southern Egypt by sea up the Nile and by sea to Byblos, or one of the ports, and then up to 3,500 feet above sea level. And so that was another incredible engineering feat. something which the Romans just couldn't have done. And we can't ignore that and many other examples of incredible skill. And there's lots more besides. So we've got to take them seriously. We've got to recognize that there were very clever people around.
It sounds like what you're talking about with the Masons, you listen to big History Channel watcher, Discovery Channel, and they talk about the priestly class or the mystery schools where they kept the knowledge secret within those groups. And it sounds like even with the Masons and the builders that they might have had one of these mystery schools where, knowledge, secret knowledge was passed on from father to son, but it wasn't necessarily common knowledge.
I think that seems to be the case, that the individual crafts and trades, particularly in metallurgy and metals, had this knowledge which they didn't allow outside their particular circle. If you're a major craftsman and your living depends on doing something really well, you don't want to give your trade secrets to somebody else. It's the same commercially today. But it was, remember, a role-type society. Everybody had their place, their role, their craft, their trade, including men and women. And remember, there was a total equality between men and women. All the communities had a man and a woman, Yahweh and Asherah, they were called, in the land of Judea, Hebraic land of Dan, the whole of that area. And it was that was the tradition of a mayor and mayoress. It didn't have to be a wife; it simply was a consort. So that every community always had a man and a woman leading it, which is very important. And I think we need to get back to that very quickly.
One of the things you were talking about a little bit earlier, and I want to touch on again, just to let you know, about 5 minutes till our next break. Was about the asteroid or the comet that did a bunch of damage to the Earth. What kind of things do they think, or have you uncovered happened to the Earth? And is this tied to the Great Flood, or is this a separate event that happened to the Earth?
There have been many events, and our astrophysicists who weren't taken seriously 10 or 15 years ago have put together a remarkable amount of information now. And as I say, the key book is Richard Firestone's The Cycle of Cosmic Catastrophe, Paul Laviolette's book called Earth Under Fire. We've got issues now about an electric universe, very important. We also are talking now about the Earth's magnetic field possibly reversing several times in the last several 100,000 years. When the Earth's magnetic field reverses on the sun, it gives massive nuclear explosions. These are all subjects which are being discussed openly, and there's a great deal of information on the Thunderbolts website, for example. And we now can date several important events. The 10,850 event, the 3,129 BC event, which was a massive cometary explosion over the Austrian Alps at Kofels, which was recorded on a planisphere by the Sumerian astronomers, would you believe? And then the real wipeout or end of the Golden Age, the great Golden Age civilizations and city-states, that came to an end at 2345 BC, 150 years after that massive spate of pyramid building. And it's my belief that they knew that there was a potential for another big wipeout. And that's why all the pyramids were built so rapidly on the Giza plateau, and why the pyramids are accompanied by massive chambers, water supplies, places to store food, etc., etc. And they knew there was a big problem coming. They didn't know how bad it would be, but they took precautions. We're saying the same thing in England. We find henges which are open clearly for observational astronomy, and then all being turned into what now called chambered tombs, but structures which people could go inside and take cover from the thing that they were almost frightened of, which was the sky falling. The same with the long barrows in Britain. We had an enormous amount of sophistication in Britain because 60-70% of the people who lived in Britain all came from that area of Canaan, something that L.A. Waddell talks about, the Phoenician origins of the British and the Scots, the Irish and the Welsh, if you like.
I think what you're saying is interesting because there are a number of myths worldwide that talk about the sky falling and the gods having to lift it back up.
Yeah. Well, the gods always got the blame when anything went wrong.
Well, that's because they were always fighting with each other. They didn't have any, they're just a funny group.
Well, I think you'll find that they named the various planets and the various objects in the sky, which were terrifying and frightening. They named them after gods. Plato will tell you that the gods were totally benevolent, and so will many other ancient historians. The gods were totally benevolent, and we use the names of gods for things happening in the sky, which was the terror which rained down from the sky, and blame the gods. And it's a way in which mankind thinks or thought over that 10,000-year period, where it's deified the gods, blame the gods, worship the gods. When things go right, it's great. When things go wrong, well, then we've got to find somebody to blame. We're all pretty primitive, really. And
just blame those Democrats. No.
my favorite quote is Mark Twain. Everybody will be familiar with it. And this was 150 years ago, Mark Twain saying that 10% of the people think, 10% think they think, and 80% would die rather than think. And due respect to everybody, I think it's quite an important point.
Well, we're going to go to a commercial break on that. I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're talking to Edmund Marriage about the book, The Shining Ones. His webpage is goldenageproject.org.uk, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages. And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and we're here talking with Edmund Marriage, webpage goldenageproject.org.uk, the book The Shining Ones. Edmund, going to shift topics here because we only have a half hour left, and I actually did make it through most of my paper, which is shocking. All right, we're talking about these Annunaki. But when you read the biblical tale, and actually when you read like the Enulu Elish, if that's how you pronounce it correctly, they talk about the creation of man by these gods. So where does mankind fit in? How does Adam and Eve fit into this whole story?
Well, the Enuma Elish is very interesting, and I think it was a man called Spicer who identified that the Enuma Elish is word for word, line for line, the same as the early chapters of Genesis, or very similar. And there is this reference to the making of man. Now, what we have to look at, I believe, is the kind of sophistication which we now know the ancients had. Very briefly, I'll say that talk to any of the leading botanists in the world, and they will tell you that they have now found that hybridization only takes place where there were ancient peoples. They can replicate that hybridization in every respect, but they can't get the seed production. In other words, the ancients who hybridized plants had a step ahead of where we are now today. Now, the domestication of crops and animals, very similar, sophistication, genetic modification of an incredibly high standard. So when we hear and see the making of man, of Adam and Eve, we're talking about in vitro fertilization to create people who clearly had the genes of the Annunaki and crossed with the genes of a local people. O'Brien deals with this in some detail, and I think the further on we've moved since he wrote the first book in 1983, we're now aware much more of the reality and practicality of in vitro fertilization of human beings. And so there clearly was a suggestion that there were people created in that way, the way we would do it today, at that particular time. The story of Adam and Eve has been very stylized to fit in with our particular religious history. Eve was, of course, sinful. She was spoken to by the serpent in the Garden of Eden, which we believe is the enclosure of Enel's great house. We know where it is, near Mount Hermon. But I think the serpent wasn't a snake. The serpent was one of the archangels, one of the wise men. They were either two-eyed serpents, which meant they were senior rank to the angels who were one-eyed serpents. And so the Adam and Eve story has been corrupted. We also have the Cain and Abel story too, which is very similar to Osiris and Seth, and then eventually the birth of Horus. And when we begin to look at all these stories, we can see that they all come from that one original source. And us, if you like, mortals, much later on, have made those stories fit our ideas and our religions, whereas I believe that the intent right from the start was a totally benevolent attempt to provide a workforce, provide different people, different skills, different abilities to make the role society work brilliantly. And this is what we see. We see the angels, or the archangels, senior angels, watchers, being the culture bearers who are talked about in every historical tradition around the world. And they really were the culture bearers who took the technology around the world for agriculture and civilization. And that included the original building of knowledge at Karsag or Eden, a whole range of experiments with in vitro fertilization.
But if the Anunnaki, the shining ones, were humans, although they had advanced technology, and then there were the lowlanders who were, I'll just say, regular old people, then why would they need to do some kind of genetic engineering? I mean, excuse the way I say this, but why can't they just have sex and make babies?
Well, good point. That did happen between some of the watchers and the local women, and it didn't go down very well for various reasons. These are issues which we've got some written evidence to give us some clues. We have to try and read between the lines and establish clearly there was in vitro fertilization. The reasons given is because they needed a workforce to be able to do all the jobs which they planned. And we hopefully will find out a great deal more when some of our key academics pick up the subject and run with it and help us to translate the texts as they should be translated, do the genetic research that needs to be done, everybody, as I said, everybody on the planet goes back to that common M158 marker at 55,000 BC, which seems to coincide with Cro-Magnon man. So we are all incredibly closely related. There's always this issue about, I'm a descendant of so-and-so, but the population dynamics over 10,000 years means that we are all very closely related, and none of us have any rights whatsoever according to bloodlines. So that's been something that's been terribly confusing and terribly misleading and not very nice, really, to say you're better than somebody else because. That's one of the great human failings, is that we don't love and care for each other as much as we should. So that's all I can add to it. I'm positive about it. I don't think it was, and I think the idea of a slave race is utter nonsense. Slaves in the very earliest city-states had rights to buy land. A slave simply meant you hadn't paid your debts, therefore you became what was called a bonded servant until you paid your debts. We had bonded servants on the streets of England in the 1920s when people needed work and where they stood on street corners waiting for somebody to come along to take them off for a job. And the whole business of slavery was very strictly organized and run fairly for the whole benefit of the whole community in the city-state golden age system. It's only much later that it became totally abused. And what is more abusive than the way in which we treat human beings today, in comparison, in my opinion, to the way that we looked after people wonderfully prior to 2345 BC.
And I agree with you. This is something that has crossed my mind when you look at some of the ancient texts. Something that has always fascinated me is that in Jewish tradition, one of their laws is that when it's the Sabbath, you have to give your slave the day off too. So you take the day off, your slave gets the day off. And I'm thinking, okay, this is written like Moses leaves Egypt, all the people leave Egypt. Now, if they came out of slavery, quote unquote, why would a slave have a slave? You know? But if it's a different way of dealing with it, where you're more indentured or, you know, and it's not slavery in the way we think of slavery, and it's kind of a mistranslation or a misinterpretation of that word, it's a different thing.
That's right, and the same as Muhammad. Muhammad's wife was a very successful businesswoman running a very big caravan train, and here you have the whole basis of Islam based on Muhammad, and Muhammad's wife was doing exactly what a Sumerian woman would have done, with own land or own camels and run a business and been highly respected in the community. Now, it doesn't happen now. The woman's put in the boot of the car if she's lucky and covered in a burqa, but that's, you know, that's a big difference to what Muhammad was doing and the way he was dealing with women in his time. And these are very important points in our history. We have to revisit and look at what was happening. Muhammad was a wonderful man. He was trying to reestablish good government, order. And he did that very successfully and very well under very difficult circumstances. And I believe Jesus was no different. He was simply trying to restore good government through the ancient system of kingship. And neither Jesus nor Muhammad wanted a new religion. They wanted to get back to the Abrahamic faith, and that's what they said. And I think we can learn an awful lot from that. And the Abrahamic faith was what was going on in the city of Ur, very well recorded, and 2,300 before the 2,345 catastrophe.
So I have this question here, and I meant to pull up the entire quote, but I'm sure you know the whole quote, or I'll probably just mess it up. But among alternative historians, you know, there is the enigmatic phrase that says, when the sons of God mated with the daughters of man, blah, 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 blah. With this new history in hand, How do you think that can be interpreted?
I think that if you have a team of, and the watchers were divided into, I think, 10s, 50s, 100s, 200s, and they were clearly all the various trades and crafts. It was incredibly efficient and amazing operation. And clearly, a lot of them broke ranks because they were human, and then they saw very pretty girls down in the lowlands, and they did what humans do. What's changed? And I think maybe the guys in charge felt that it had got out of hand. I don't think we can build much more into it than that. I don't think we should. And I think that we're all very, very clever putting our noses into other people's dirty washing, but we don't need to. We shouldn't do. And it's a human story, and we find many human stories here within the Karsak epics of both Enlil and Enlil and Enki both getting food poisoning, and clearly described. So they were just like us. They enjoyed a glass of wine. They enjoyed a good party. They ate meat, and they had their failings. The lady Ninkarsag got very upset and cried in front of the council. You're dealing with real live people who were our ancestors, very, very, very similar to us. And it's very important to see this and to realize this and have respect for them, as all the subsequent knowledgeable people had immense respect for them. I would add, too, about the Sumerian kings. The one thing that L.A. Waddell did was to get the chronology right on the Sumerian kings. And the first or oldest Sumerian king was 3,370 BC. In other words, there was a big mistake made over the Icene text by one man at Cambridge who got all the numbers wrong. And the first Sumerian king was really to pull together the city-states in the region, and they appointed what we would call a king of kings, of Bradwell in Saxon, Shishak in Sumeria, Ozymandias in Greek, a Pendragon in England, and they took the senior king in times of difficulty, either by usually weather, poor harvests. They would pull things together, and it was a pulling together of all the city-states in the region. That's why we get the origin of the Sumerian people. But the Sumerians were always there. They didn't come in from anywhere else. They were always in that area, and they evolved from the people from the land of Canaan. And so the two of the most misused words we have are Semitic and Aryan. And it's a great shame those two words are used in the way they are used.
Okay, so if the Sumerian kingship started in 3000 plus BC, and there were 8 kings prior to the Great Flood, then when did the flood happen?
Well, there was a Noah who was a king in Sumer when there was a flood, a very big flood in the Mesopotamian Valley, and that was very well recorded by Leonard Woolley when he did his excavations in Ur, and was a big layer of silt, and they've got the dates for that, which was round about the time when we saw a peak in sea levels, and there may have been natural disaster regions for that flood. So there were many floods and many recorded floods, and the latest big flood would have been recorded by the Sumerians. So we had the first massive movement of water was when the earth tipped on its axis. Enoch describes this record of the earth being realigned on its axis, and there was a lot of evidence for the movement of the earth on its axis and the oceans literally washing across the landmass. And in the States, there's a suggestion that the Salt Lakes, where the seawater stopped against the Rockies, that's where you have evidence of massive quantities of water washing across the whole of the country. And this shows up in the geological record all over the place with caves full of debris. So the big flood was 10,850, but there were many other floods later on, and the biblical flood is a confusion between much later floods, in particular the one in Mesopotamia about 4,000 BC, so some 6,000 years later.
Okay, so you're saying that they have found evidence that there actually have been two floods, one more global and then one more localized, which is the quote-unquote Noah flood.
Correct.
You learn something new every day. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to have you back on because, as I told you before we started, I got through about chapter 4 of this book. I mean, this book is loaded, everybody, with just mega information. And really what we talked about was the first few chapters of this book, and it goes into a whole lot more history, but we have just really been talking about prehistory. Yeah, that sounds fair. But maybe we can do a little teaser. You've talked about Enoch a number of times, and I think people have heard that name, but maybe you can kind of give them some information as to who Enoch was and what his role was in our society.
Well, Enoch, as I understand it, is a Hebrew name for somebody who was called Thoth, who was called Hermes. He may have even been called Mercury. He was the messenger or the scribe of the gods. Difficult to pin it down, but clearly he was a very important early figure. The books of Enoch were considered so important that they were included in the Christian church canon, and only removed from the collection or canon of important books by St. Jerome in about 290. And they were always thought to be, by the elders of the church, a forecast or a prophecy of something that was going to happen in the future. And O'Brien makes the point when clearly the books of Enoch were a very accurate and detailed account of something that happened in the past. So we can describe Enoch as the original great historian and probably the same person as Thoth, and certainly very much involved with writing because he was there to record the books of the gods. So the gods had already had books, but they wanted their records to be copied and kept by Enoch. In fact, the books that Enoch is supposed to have recorded and written down were lost in a later flood, an example of a later flood taking place. But as I say, a lot of these are all clues for researchers to make their own contributions. And if we can get more people making contributions on the subject, it will be really helpful because I think we can move everything forward. I'm
just going to change subjects again. What are your thoughts on some of the new sites that have been found in the last few years? And what I'm thinking of particularly is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. You know, you mentioned Jericho being from 9,000 BC or 9,000 years old, and they're dating this site, the Göbekli Tepe, as being about 9,000 BC. But when you actually compare Jericho architecturally and structurally to what there is in Turkey, you know, one seems much more primitive than the other. But what do you think about the Turkey site, Göbekli Tepe?
Well, just very quickly on Jericho, the latest research from the Jerusalem University is that the tower at Jericho was used for observational astronomy, a marker on the side of a hill. So they were very much into observational astronomy at 9,000 BC. That's the hot latest news. And Kathleen Kenyon, when she excavated Jericho, found amazing sophistication in the construction of the tower at Jericho and the stonework with slabs, and said it wouldn't disgrace a medieval castle. In addition to that, there's a rock-cut ditch right round the original Jericho, which is about 30 feet wide by 9 feet deep, cut through solid rock. And that's what we find in the great watercourse that went out of Eden to water the garden in the Rishaya Basin. We don't know how on earth they cut that rock. So there was great sophistication at Jericho, great sophistication at the Garden of Eden site. Now, Göbekli Tepe is wonderful. It's the top of a hill. And it may well have been built during the Younger Dryas or even before the Younger Dryas. The point about being on the top of the hill was that in the very cold weather, if you were on the top of the hill, you got the maximum amount of sun, which meant it was warmer. You find the same thing in New Mexico on the tops of hills with the Clovis people at the boundary between the Clovis and the Folsom people. And if there are animals still alive and you are hunting animals or a gazelle or antelope and you're on the top of a hill, you can see where your breakfast, lunch and tea is moving down below, and you go downhill before you catch them or spear them or whatever you do. It's much easier to do that from the top of a hillside. Now, at Göbekli Tepe, all the uprights, and there's 126 of them, are literally prefabricated, standardized T-posts, which would have supported a massive roof, then covered with earth. There was timber used clearly, so when that timber rotted, then the roof fell down, and that's where they think it was filled in later. It was simply the roof collapsing after a period of time when the timber had rotted. Now, on the post, you find every conceivable species that were moved around in that area recorded in beautiful carvings, and it was clearly an outpost of angels, watchers, whatever, people exploring the region. And these are the kind of descriptions we have in the books of Enoch. So it is contemporary with Karsag, which is the Garden of Eden site. It certainly wasn't a farming center because it was too cold, 800 years behind the southern Bekaa and the Dead Sea Valley. So it wasn't farming. It was on the top of a hill, good reasons to be on the top of the hill, although they would have had to carry their water up there, as far as I can see. But Göbekli Tepe is fantastic because it's an example of sophistication which links in with the Garden of Eden site and Jericho at the same dates, and therefore I believe they're connected. Very, very important.
And from what I understand, where they have found some of the first signs of agriculture, planned agriculture, was not very far from that location.
The stories of agriculture starting close to that location have been disproved.
I didn't know that.
Yes, and this is very important. There've been a lot of people banging this bandwagon about agriculture starting in Turkey, Anatolia, around Göbekli Tepe. There is not any evidence or any dating which puts crops in that area, reliable evidence which puts crops out in the area. And from the bioarchaeological record, as I said, it was 800 years behind in terms of the big increase in temperatures, and many of those crops were first possibly domesticated crops, which then went wild, or were originally wild crops. And there's quite a lot written about this by Steve Gagne on the website, and Steve being the author of The Energetics of Food, who's done probably more on the subject of early agriculture and the problems of identifying where farming started. A Jewish archaeologist called Bar Joseph makes a very important point that we're looking here at Jericho area, southern Bekaa, for the origins of the earliest wheats and barleys and many of the other crops, and not the area of Anatolia or north of the Tigris and Euphrates.
The music is going to come up in 1 second, and I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all of this wisdom. And like I said, we've just scratched the surface of it.
Well, thank you so much. I've enjoyed it enormously, and I hope the audience have picked up a few things. And I'd love to come and talk to you again, and thank you for being so kind.
Well, we will definitely have you back on. Definitely. Okay, this is Dr. Rita Louise. We were talking with Edmund Marriage about his book, The Shining Ones. Let me see. Next week, we're going to have Keith Blanchard on talking about getting into the zone, and Brian Forrester talking about the megalithic buildings of the Inca. And so until next week, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just